The laugh it was a quiet morning in Chennai, with the soft smell of rain still lingering in the air, when Sundar Pichai woke up to an email that would change his life. The email was short and simple, but it carried the weight of a dream he had, carried since he was a boy. You are invited for a live interview on International News Network this Saturday. To talk about your vision for technology. Sundar stared at it for a long moment. His hands trembled a little. The memory of his father working late into the night to pay for Sundar's textbooks came rushing back. All those nights he had spent hunched over borrowed computers at the library suddenly felt worth it. He arrived in New York 3 days later, wearing the same humble smile and a neatly pressed but modest suit. The studio lights were bright, the cameras cold and unblinking. The host, a well-known television reporter named Michael, gave Sundar a quick handshake, without looking him in the eye. Then Michael chuckled under his breath as they sat down at the shiny glass table. The laugh was faint, but Sundar heard it. As the cameras started rolling, Michael began introducing Sundar with a tone that felt just a little too amused. And here we have Mr. Sundar Pichai, let's say, bold dreamer from India who thinks he can tell us what the future of technology looks like. So Sundar, tell us, do you really believe that someone like you can make an impact in Silicon Valley? The words were sharp, but the laugh that followed cut even deeper. The studio audience chuckled softly too, and Sundar felt his cheeks burn. But he forced himself to smile back. Yes, he said simply. I believe that anyone, no matter where they come from, can change the world. Michael leaned back, smirking. That's quite an ambitious thought, isn't it? Especially for someone who grew up. Where did you say again? A tiny flat in Madras? You shared a room with how many people? 3, Sundar replied. And it was not a flat, just a single room. The audience laughed again, louder this time. Sundar swallowed hard, but inside, something sparked. He remembered the nights he'd read old manuals by candlelight. He remembered his mother skipping dinner so he could have a proper lunch at school. He remembered the shame he used to feel, walking barefoot past the big offices downtown, and how he promised himself he would one day walk through their doors with his head held high. Michael kept talking, interrupting Sundar's answers with sarcastic jokes. But Sundar stayed calm. He spoke about his vision of making technology accessible to everyone, to the poor farmer, to the school child in a remote village, to the grandmother who had never touched a computer. Every time he finished a sentence, Michael laughed lightly, as though Sundar's words were naive, even ridiculous. But then something unexpected happened. As Sundar spoke about connecting villages in India with the internet. A producer behind the cameras glanced at her tablet and suddenly gasped. She whispered something to the director, who turned pale. The director leaned forward, signaling for Michael to wrap up quickly. But Michael ignored him. Well, Sundar. Michael sneered. Maybe in a few decades, someone will take your dreams seriously. But today, the producer suddenly interrupted live on air, her voice urgent. Michael, you should see this. Michael stopped, mid-sentence, irritated. We're on air. What is it? The producer held up the tablet, showing a news alert. Flashing brightly, Michael's eyes widened. His smirk disappeared. The screen showed, breaking news, Google announces new CEO, Sundar Pichai. The studio went silent. Michael swallowed hard and looked at Sundar, who sat quietly, his hands folded. The cameras kept rolling as the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Sundar finally looked up at Michael, his voice soft but steady. Would you like me to answer the rest of your questions, or shall we talk about this instead? The audience gasped. Some even clapped, and Michael's face turned red. Sundar gave a small, humble smile, but inside, he felt the years of struggle and quiet endurance finally come full circle, and just when it seemed the moment would end, Michael leaned forward and whispered, You may have impressed them, Sundar, but you won't last. The words hung in the air like a threat. Sundar didn't reply, but in his heart, he knew this was just the beginning. The storm the morning after the live interview. The newspapers around the world were already ablaze with headlines about Sundar. Pichai's quiet but brilliant triumph. They called him the man who embarrassed the arrogant reporter without raising his voice. Photos of Sundar sitting calmly under the studio lights, while Michael's smirk melted into disbelief, were everywhere. On the streets of Chennai, children pointed at his picture on the front page and said his name with pride. His old neighbors gathered around the small tea shop, nodding to each other, remembering the shy boy who used to walk past them with his head bowed but in California. As Sundar prepared for his first day as the new CEO of Google, he felt none of that pride. He sat in the backseat of a black car, staring out the window at the glass towers of Silicon Valley, his hands resting on his knees. The driver tried to make conversation, asked him if he was excited, or if he'd slept at all. But Sundar only smiled faintly and said nothing. Inside, his heart was pounding, not with joy, but with worry, because he knew the real test had not even begun when he arrived at the headquarters. Employees lined the lobby, clapping politely as he passed by. They had been told to welcome him. But he could feel it, the stiffness in their shoulders, the polite but empty smiles. He could hear the murmurs behind him as he walked toward the elevators. They didn't say it aloud, but Sundar had heard enough whispers in his life to know what they meant. Too young, too soft, too foreign. He had heard it when he won a scholarship to study in the United States, when he got his first job at Google, when he proposed the idea of a lighter, faster browser that everyone said would fail. He had heard it so many times he no longer flinched, but it never stopped hurting. The boardroom was waiting for him on the top floor, as he pushed the door open. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him. The room was vast and quiet, with a long polished table that stretched toward a wall of windows. The view outside was breathtaking, the whole valley shimmering under the morning sun, but no one was looking at the view. They were all watching him. He walked to the head of the table, placed his folder down, and smiled. "Good morning." He said softly that there was a rustle of papers. A few nods. Then silence. He began his speech, outlining his vision for the company, his ideas for making their products more accessible to everyone, his belief that Google could not just innovate, but also bring dignity and opportunity to millions of people who had been left behind by technology. He spoke of his childhood in Chennai, of borrowing books from neighbors, of waiting in line to use a public phone because his family couldn't afford one. He spoke with honesty and hope, and for a moment he let himself believe they were listening. But halfway down the table, a man named Robert shifted in his chair, then leaned back with a faint smile. He was one of the most senior executives, known for his sharp suits and sharper tongue. He tapped his pen lightly on the table, interrupting Sundar mid-sentence. "That's all very touching," Robert said, his tone polite but dripping with something colder. "But with all due respect, this isn't a charity, Sundar. We don't sell dreams. We sell products. And we're here to make money, not sentimental speeches." A few of the others chuckled under their breath. Sundar froze. For a moment, he could feel the heat rising to his face. He thought of the cruel teacher he had faced as a boy, the one who mocked him in front of the whole class for getting a question wrong. He remembered how his hands had shaken, how his knees had locked, how he almost walked out of school that day and never went back. But then he remembered something else, the way his father had walked him back to that same school the next morning, placed a hand on his shoulder, and whispered, "Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth. Only you decide that. So now..." Sundar looked right at Robert, and instead of shrinking, he smiled. "Thank you for saying that," Sundar replied quietly. "You're right. We do need to make money. But we also need to earn trust. And if we only focus on profits, we will lose both." Robert blinked, caught off guard. Sundar didn't raise his voice, didn't glare, just kept speaking calmly but firmly until even the chuckles faded into silence. But as the meeting went on, Sundar began to notice more. The glances between Robert and another executive at the far end of the table. The way a few of them avoided meeting his eyes when he spoke. The quiet whispers when he turned to the projector dot when the meeting finally ended and the others filed. Out of the room, one man, a younger executive named Anil, stayed behind. He had always been kind to Sundar, even before the promotion. He closed the door and leaned in, his voice low. Be careful, Anil said. There are already people here, planning to push you out. They don't think you belong here. Sundar felt a chill crawl down his spine. Asterisk. How do you know? Yes. And Anil hesitated. Because I was in the room when they talked about it. Robert and two others. They're meeting again tonight, off campus. I don't know what they're planning, but it's not good. Sundar sat down slowly. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Anil placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry, he whispered. I thought you should know. And then he left, asterisk. Alone in the boardroom, Sundar stared out at the valley below. The sun had moved higher now, but the light seemed harsher somehow, less welcoming. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the crowded trains of Chennai, the sleepless nights of study, the humiliations he had endured quietly. And he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. But as he stood there, something inside him hardened. He thought of his father's words again. He thought of the millions of people who would look at him and see themselves. He could not let them down. Later that night, after everyone had left the office, Sundar stayed behind. He sat at his desk, pretending to work, waiting. And when the lights in the building finally dimmed and the parking lot emptied, he quietly slipped out, took a cab, and followed the directions Anil had given him. The address led him to a private house at the edge of town. Through the window, he could see them, Robert and two others, sitting around a table, papers and laptops spread before them. They were talking, gesturing angrily, but Sundar couldn't hear what they were saying. Then one of them held up. Document. Sundar squinted, and his stomach dropped. At the top of the page in bold letters. He could just make out the words, Proposal to replace CEO, timeline, 6 months. Sundar stepped back into the shadows. The cool night air suddenly felt suffocating. His mind was racing, but he kept his breathing steady. He knew now that this was no ordinary resistance. This was a plan. And somewhere deep down, he also knew the storm was only just beginning. Asterisk. The fall of rain started early that morning. Soft at first, but growing heavier with each passing hour. Sundar stood by the window of his office, watching the gray sky melt into sheets of water that streaked across the glass. He barely noticed the sound of his assistant knocking gently on the door behind him. The desk was piled high with folders and reports, but his attention stayed fixed on a single document that lay open in front of him. A schedule for the product launch that would either cement his place as CEO or shatter everything he had worked for. Today was supposed to be a triumph. After months of late nights, endless meetings, and quiet endurance of whispered doubts, the company was finally unveiling its most ambitious project yet, a revolutionary platform designed to bring artificial intelligence into the hands of ordinary people. It was Sundar's idea, his vision, the proof that humility and kindness could guide innovation, just as well as ambition and ruthlessness. He had poured himself into every detail. He had walked the factory floors at midnight, listened to the engineers' frustrations, written personal notes of thanks to the team members no one else noticed. He had promised himself, and silently his parents, that this launch would not just be about technology. It would be about hope. But as he stood there in the quiet of his office, watching the rain blur the view of the city below, something heavy settled in his chest, because he knew. Somewhere deep down, he already knew. When the call finally came, it wasn't even the words that hurt. It was the silence on the other end after the voice said, "We have a problem." He walked briskly down the hall to the command room, his footsteps echoing. When he entered, the screens were already lit up with disaster. Live feeds from the launch sites showed journalists frowning, engineers scrambling, and the new platform. The one everyone had called Sundar's dream, freezing, crashing, and failing in front of the whole world. His team turned to him when he walked in. Their faces said it all. Some looked angry. Others looked sorry. A few wouldn't meet his eyes at all. The system can't handle the load, one of the engineers muttered almost apologetically. We thought we were ready. But it's breaking down. And then Robert spoke. His voice carried over the hum of panic. We warned you, Sundar, he said, standing in the corner with his arms crossed. We told you this was too soon. But you didn't listen, and now this, for a moment, no one spoke. The room was filled with the sound of keys clattering, phones ringing, and the faint hiss of static from the speakers. Sundar stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the table. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, he felt as if he were sinking. He thought of his childhood, of the day he had dropped his mother's favorite clay pot while trying to help her. How she had paused, looked at him, and then simply swept the broken pieces aside with a quiet sigh. No shouting, no anger. Only quiet disappointment. That was what this felt like. Reporters began tweeting within minutes. Headlines flashed across the internet. Google's AI dream turns into nightmare. Pichai's project crashes live on stage. Company loses millions. By the afternoon, the board had called an emergency meeting. Sundar sat at the far end of the table, while the others argued about him as though he weren't even there. He's inexperienced, someone said. We should have listened to Robert, another chimed in. We can't afford another failure like this. He listened quietly, absorbing each word like a blow. But he didn't flinch. When the meeting ended and the others left the room, he stayed behind. He sat alone in the big, empty boardroom as the rain finally stopped and a weak sun broke through. The clouds. He picked up his phone and called his mother. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm and gentle, as if nothing had changed. I saw the news, she said softly. He swallowed hard, resting his forehead on his hand. I'm sorry, he whispered. She was silent for a moment. And then she said, Sundar, do you remember when you fell off your bicycle and everyone laughed at you? He closed his eyes. Yes. Do you remember what you did the next day? He opened his eyes slowly. I got back on. That's right, she said. You didn't ride fast. You didn't even ride well. But you got back on. He smiled faintly, despite the heaviness in his chest. Thank you. And after he hung up, he sat there in the quiet for a long while, staring at the empty chairs around the table. Later that night, he returned to his office, long after everyone else had gone home. He rolled up his sleeves, opened his laptop, and began reading every error report himself. Line by line, page by page. He didn't leave the building. He didn't sleep, but as the night deepened and the city outside fell silent, he felt a strange calm settle over him. And then, just as he was about to close the last file, his phone buzzed. An anonymous number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, low, hurried, spoke on the other end. They planned this. The voice said, the failure. It wasn't an accident. They sabotaged you. Sundar froze. Who is this? He demanded, but the line had already gone dead. He sat there for a long moment, the words echoing in his mind. Failure. Wasn't an accident. He slowly put the phone down, his hands cold. Through the dark glass of his office window, he could see the faint lights of the city below. And somewhere beyond those lights, he could almost hear Robert's quiet laughter. He stood up, his resolve hardening. If they thought he would break, they didn't know him at all. The 5 following morning. The sun rose sharp and clear over Silicon Valley, but Sundar felt only the weight of darkness inside him. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his hands gripping the edge of the sink. His face in the reflection looked older, more tired. There were faint shadows under his eyes now, a tightness in his jaw he hadn't noticed before. The words from the anonymous caller echoed in his mind over and over. They planned this. The failure wasn't an accident. They sabotaged you. He splashed cold water on his face, but it did nothing to wash away the thought. When he arrived at the office, the lobby was quiet. No polite applause this time. No smiles. People passed him in the hallway without meeting his eyes. Some whispered when he walked by. He could feel it, the story spreading like smoke through every corner of the building. But what they didn't know was that Sundar had spent the entire night going through the system logs himself. And what he found chilled him. buried deep in. The code were strange edits, tiny, deliberate changes that would never have been noticed during the frantic lead-up to the launch. At first, he thought it might be human error, but the patterns were too precise, too intentional. Someone on his own team had written those lines of sabotage. Someone trusted Dot. He closed his office door behind him and sank into his chair. For a moment, he simply stared at the city skyline outside. Then he picked up the phone and called ANIL. ANIL arrived 20 minutes later, looking nervous. His tie was loose, his hair slightly disheveled. He closed the door softly behind him. "I need your help," Sundar said quietly. Anil nodded, sliding into the chair opposite. "Whatever you need." Sundar opened his laptop and turned the screen toward him. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the lines of code he had uncovered. And Il leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read. After a long moment, he sat back, his face pale. "This isn't random," he whispered. "Someone planted this. They wanted the system to fail." "I know," Sundar said. Asterisk Anil swallowed hard. "Do you think Robert?" Sundar didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and began pacing the room. "I don't want to accuse anyone without proof," he said slowly. "But I also won't let this go. Not this time." Anil hesitated. "What are you going to do?" Sundar stopped by the window, staring out at the quiet courtyard below. "I'm going to fight," he said. That evening, he asked the head of security to pull access logs and camera footage from the past month. He stayed late into the night again, watching hours of grainy recordings, noting who came and went at odd hours. His eyes ached from the strain, but he kept going. Asterisk. And that's when he saw it. Robert, slipping into the server room at midnight, just 3 nights before the launch. Staying there alone for nearly an hour, Sundar leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. But what hurt more than the betrayal was what came next. As he reviewed the footage, he saw another figure enter the room after Robert. Someone he trusted completely. ANIL. For a long time. Sundar just sat there, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like a stone. The next morning, he called a meeting with both of them. They arrived together, Robert with his usual smug confidence, Anil with his head slightly bowed. "You asked to see us?" Robert said smoothly as he took a seat. Sundar stayed standing. He looked at them both, his eyes steady. "I know what you did," he said softly. Robert's single quotes as smirk didn't falter. But Anil flinched. "I know you sabotaged the launch," Sundar continued. "I know you edited code. I know you planted the errors." For the first time, Robert looked genuinely surprised, but only for a second. Then he leaned back, chuckling under his breath. "You really are smarter than you look," Robert said. Al kept staring at the floor, his hands twisting. "In his lap? Why?" Sundar asked quietly. Robert shrugged. "Because you don't belong here. Because this company needs a leader, not whatever it is you're pretending to be. People like you don't last here, Sundar. I was just helping speed things along." Sundar turned to Anil. "And you?" Anil finally looked up, his eyes red. I'm sorry," he whispered. "He promised me a promotion. He said you would be gone in a few months anyway." I didn't want to believe him, but I was afraid. For a long moment, Sundar said nothing. He just looked at them both, his face calm, but his hands trembling slightly behind his back. Then he nodded. "Thank you for being honest," he said. He picked up a folder from the table and placed it in front of them. Inside were copies of the security footage, the access logs, the edited code, all of it neatly documented. "You have until the end of the day to submit your resignations," Sundar said quietly. "If you don't, this goes to the board, and then to the authorities." Robert's smile finally faded. Anil looked like he might cry. They left the room without another word. But even as the door closed behind them, Sundar didn't feel triumphant. Instead, he felt a deep sadness. He thought of how Anil had once brought him tea late at night, how they had laughed together over old memories of India, how he had truly believed, that kindness could win over ambition. He sank into his chair, resting his head in his hands. A few hours later, just as he was preparing to leave, his assistant knocked and slipped a small envelope onto his desk. "This came for you," she said. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few handwritten words. "You handled Robert well. Now it's time you learn the truth. Meet me tonight." There was an address written below. A quiet cafe on the edge of the city. Sundar stared at the note, his heart beating faster. He knew exactly who him was. Michael. The reporter, the same man who had laughed at him on live television, and now he was asking to meet. But why? And what truth was he talking about? Sundar folded the note slowly, slipping it into his pocket. He stood up, his resolve hardening once again. Whatever came next, he would face it. Because he knew now this fight was bigger than him. The Truth Cafe at the edge of the city was nearly empty when Sundar arrived that evening. It was one of those quiet, forgotten places tucked between warehouses, where the air smelled faintly of roasted coffee and rain-washed concrete. He stepped through the door and stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim yellow light at the far corner. A figure sat with his back to the wall, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. Michael, the reporter. Sundar walked over slowly, feeling a strange mix of wariness and curiosity. Michael looked up as he approached, and for the first time there was no smirk, no trace of mockery on his face, only something tired and heavy in his eyes. "You came?" Michael said softly. Sundar slid into the chair opposite him, resting, his hands on the table. "What do you want?" he asked. Michael let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair. For a moment, he just stared at the steam rising from his coffee before speaking. "The night of that interview," he began, his voice low, "I thought I was destroying you. I thought you were just another idealist with nothing but empty words. But then I started hearing things, whispers about what was really going on at Google, and I realized I'd been used to." Sundar narrowed his eyes slightly. "Used? By who?" Michael glanced around the cafe as if making sure no one was listening. Then he leaned in closer. "Robert was just the front," he said. "There's a group, former executives, investors, and some outside players. They're tied to a competing company. They've been working quietly for years to destabilize Google from the inside. First with small mistakes, then bigger ones. They want to drive the stock down, force a leadership change, and take over." Sundar listened silently, his face calm, but his stomach twisting. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked finally. Michael single quotes. Eyes met his, and for the first time, Sundar saw no trace of arrogance there, only regret. "Because I was part of it," Michael said. His voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. "I didn't realize at first. They paid me to humiliate you, to plant stories in the press, to make you look weak. But then I saw what they did to you, how you never fought back, how you just kept going, and I couldn't do it anymore." For a long moment, the two men just sat there, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the space between them. Sundar finally spoke, his voice steady. "If what you're saying is true, then why didn't you come forward sooner?" Michael looked down at his hands. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "But now, it's gone too far. They're planning something much bigger. They want you out, and they don't care what happens to you in the process. They're not just sabotaging projects anymore. They're going after you personally, your reputation, your family, everything." Sundar sat back in his chair, letting the words sink in. He thought of his mother, his father, the small home in Chennai. He thought of every sacrifice, every quiet humiliation, every hour of work that had brought him here. And now it seemed the fight was not just for his job, but for his name. "Do you have proof?" he asked. Michael nodded. "I've been collecting emails, recordings, financial records, everything. But it's not safe for me to keep them. That's why I asked. You here?" He reached into his jacket and slid a small flash drive across the table. Sundar stared at it for a moment before picking it up. "What happens now?" Sundar asked quietly. Michael hesitated. Then he looked him in the eye. Now, you decide what kind of man you want to be, he said. You can go to the board quietly, try to fix it from inside. Or you can go public, risk everything, and expose them. Sundar closed his hand around the flash drive, feeling its weight as though it were a stone in his palm. And what about you? He asked. Michael gave a faint, bitter smile. Me? I've already lost everything. My career, my credibility. But maybe if you win, at least it won't have been for nothing. Sundar sat in silence, the sounds of clinking cups and murmured conversation around him fading into nothing. He thought of the boy he had been, the one who had walked barefoot to school, clutching his books to his chest, refusing to look up when others laughed at him. And he thought of his father's words, spoken in the quiet of a darkened kitchen. So many years ago, you don't choose when to fight, you only choose how. He stood up slowly, slipping the flash drive into his pocket. Thank you, he said softly. Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. Outside, the night air was cool and heavy with the smell of wet earth. Sundar walked alone down the empty street, his mind already racing. He knew he couldn't go to the board yet. Not until he understood exactly what he was up against. When he finally returned to his apartment, he sat at his desk, plugged in the flash drive, and began reading. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Not just emails and payments, but names, powerful names, people he thought he could trust. Board members, investors, even politicians. And at the center of it all was a single signature that he recognized instantly. A name he never thought he would see on a document like this. Someone from his own past. He leaned back in his chair, the flash drive still glowing faintly in the dark. Roomed out, the last line of one email stayed burned in his mind. Finish what we started. Remove him within 2 weeks. Permanently. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen. Then he shut the laptop, stood up, and looked out at the city lights below. He knew now that the real fight was just beginning. And this time, they were just coming for his job. They were coming for him. Asterisk the triumph. Morning of the conference arrived with a strange stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Sundar stood in front of the tall glass windows of his office, watching the city wake up. Cars moved slowly through the fog. The faint hum of traffic below barely reached him. His suit jacket hung neatly on the back of his chair, but he had yet to put it on. Instead, he stood there in shirt sleeves, his hands folded behind his back, thinking of everything that had led to this moment.